Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST webinar, the Gut Microbiome, a whole new world to explore, organised by the IFST Food Science and Nutrition Special Interest Group. My name is Dr. Terry Grasby. I'm the events lead of the group and a lecturer in food science at the University of Surrey. The gut microbiome has risen in prominence in the last decade, with many more consumers being aware of the concept of good bacteria and the two-way relationship with human health. There are generally two ways to affect the gut microbiota through food: the inclusion of viable live bacteria or probiotics and/or dietary fibres, otherwise known as prebiotics. According to the SAC and Carbohydrate Report published in 2015, increased dietary fibre intake results in a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary events, stroke, type 2 diabetes and colon cancer. And more recent studies have shown effects on the immune system and mental health. However, other nutrients and phytochemicals also have positive effects on the gut microbiota, giving other routes for food manufacturers to reformulate their products for improved population health. Therefore, we wanted to present a webinar covering the latest research for IFST members and our guests, and also provide an opportunity to ask questions of our experts. Next slide, please. So this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to IFST's Webinar Hub. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. This can also be used in the case of any technical difficulties. There will be a Q&A session after the presentations, which will be moderated by Kate Halliwell, the Chief Scientific Officer at the Food and Drink Federation, and this will allow our speakers to respond to as many of these questions as possible. And our speakers today are Martin Warren, Gary Tucker and Kevin Sensula. Our first speaker, Martin, is the head of the Food Innovation and Health Research Programme at Quadram Institute Bioscience. His research is aimed at striking a balance between macronutrient content and micronutrient availability. And he did his PhD at the University of Southampton before working at Texas A&M University, the University of Kent, Queen Mary University of London and University College London. And today he'll be talking about vitamins, minerals, health and the microbiome. Our second speaker, Gary, is a research fellow at Camden BRI, where he has worked for over 30 years. He's a chemical engineer by training and has researched and published extensively across a range of bakery processing and technology areas. He'll be speaking about the nutritional role of bread to aid healthy digestion. And our final speaker, Kevin Sensula, is the marketing manager for probiotics at Kerry. He manages the marketing activities for Kerry's probiotic business following an MBA at the University of Wisconsin. Today, he'll be talking about the role that probiotics play in health and the regulatory environment that governs their use, as well as the importance of ensuring probiotic viability. For more information on their biographies, please look at the IFST website. So with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, Martin Warren.
Thank you very much, Terry. So I'm going to talk a little bit just in general terms about the kind of research that I do and that we undertake at the Quadram Institute in Norwich. I personally have a very strong interest in vitamins and minerals and their contribution to health and their role in biological systems in general. So the Quadram Institute is a relatively new building and institute. It's incorporated parts of the old Institute for Food Research, the IFR. It's done in conjunction with the University of East Anglia and has substantial funding from one of the research councils, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. And it's also developed in partnership with the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital. So it's a new building. It's a new institute. The building's been up and running for about just over 2 years. And it's state of the art in terms of its laboratories and infrastructure. And the top 2 floors are effectively all research, but there's a basement which houses the hospital endoscopy unit. And that endoscopy unit links in with a lot of the research that we do within the Quadram, which is based on the microbiome and the role of the microbiome in health and well-being. And our science in general is underpinned by about £40 million of current funding, mainly from BBSRC, but also from a number of other sources as well. So within the quadrant, we do basic bioscience. It's interdisciplinary aspects of biochemistry, molecular biology, nutrition, health, and so on. And some of that is basic, but the basic findings that we take, we try and utilize for useful purposes. So there's a lot of translational research as well. The kind of research we do, especially with some of it's related to food, allows us to investigate clinical aspects of food and health. And as I mentioned, because the basement of the building houses an endoscopy unit, which sees upwards of 40,000 patients a year, it gives us enormous clinical research capability to investigate changes and the effect of the microbiome on health in general as well. So within the quadrant, we have three main research programs. One is gut microbes and health, and that's very much focused on the microbiome. There's the food innovation and health program, and the food innovation and health program is very much about developing new foods and looking at how those foods are digested and how they feed into the microbiome. So that relates, so there's a connection between the food that we look at and develop and the effect that has on the microbiome and how that generates health overall. And then the third research program is very much microbes in the food chain, which is more to do with food safety and the effects of various food pathogens and the effect that they have on food spoilage and in causing a disease. So that's a very quick overview of what goes on within the quadrant. As Terry highlighted, I head the Food and Innovation and Health program. And there, as I said, we're interested in looking at developments for instance, in crop and crop science and how that can be incorporated into new foods. And in particular, we're very interested in ways in trying to reduce the macronutrient content. So, with the obesity crisis that we have, can we reduce the amount of available carbohydrate in foods by developing crops that, for instance, have starches that are less resistant to digestion? And that's one aspect of the work. And by taking the food, we then look at what happens to that food. It goes through the digestive system. So we look at it in terms of what happens in the small intestine, where we get a lot of absorption of micronutrients, through to the large intestine, where the microbiome largely sits and where it has an effect on fermenting some of that food. And the microbiome plays an incredibly important role in helping to break down some of those more resistant bits of protein and carbohydrate, and can provide a lot of useful compounds. And then overall, we try and understand the overall control, the metabolic homeostasis of food in relation to health as well. So in terms of the gut microbiome, the gut microbiome contains somewhere up to sort of 1,000 different bacterial species. Although the majority of the bacteria probably fall within 40 species. So there's a broad range of different bacteria that can live in our gut, but most of those are occupied with a more focused group. Those bacteria live in the absence of oxygen, so they're very much anaerobic, so they ferment food. And it's understanding that fermentative process, which is important because the gut microbiome is a very dynamic population. It changes as we vary our food and as we vary our diet. And the population of those different bacterial species change and moderate. And what of course can happen is that gut microbe population can be overrun by one particular type of bacteria, and that can cause a dysbiosis, which can then lead to problems and give rise to various conditions relating to health, including things like irritable bowel disease and IBS. So there's a whole range of things that can go wrong depending on what's happening with our microbiome. So the gut microbiome clearly plays a very important role in metabolism. As I said, it helps break down undigested foods and helps provide a range of smaller molecules which feed into our body, and those help communicate not only with the liver but also with the brain. So we have this whole gut-brain axis, and a lot of that is mediated through the function of the microbiome. And those microbiomes can also provide various nutrients to the body. For instance, some of the vitamins such as biotin, which is vitamin B7, or folate, which is B9, or vitamin K. So the substantial amount of vitamins can come from the gut microbiome. And whilst the microbiome can provide nutrients, to have a healthy microbiome, we've also got to provide it with nutrients as well, because they can't always provide everything for themselves. So it's that give and take which helps to give rise to a diverse microbiome, which is required for health. So the kinds of questions that we have to ask, and we continue to research within the Quadrum, is, how does that microbiome vary with food? What effects do new foods have? So new foods and innovation in food development, what effect does that have on the microbiome? What is the effect of supplements, if people are taking vitamin supplements? How does that change the microbiome composition? What happens to the microbiome in terms of health as we change diet, for instance, going from omnivore diet to vegetarian to vegan? What kinds of things happen? I particularly have a strong emphasis on vitamin B12. That's a nutrient that's completely absent from crops. And it's a nutrient that's only made by bacteria, and it helps propagate other bacteria to live. So how does that interaction take place? And can we help develop more foods that have this lower macronutrient content but have a higher micronutrient content, because it's getting that balance correct, which is so important to help develop food and new foods as we change our diet and try to take on a more healthy lifestyle. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, and for listening, to give an introduction to what's going on in the Quadrum with our research in the microbiome field. And I'll now hand over to Gary. So the stage is yours, Gary.
Thank you, Martin. So I'm going to now talk about the nutritional role of bread and the way that that's a product that can be designed to aid the healthy digestion. Camden BRI does work very closely with groups like Quadrum, and our role is very much to sort of take that understanding that those groups are developing, and then to help food companies to develop products and to develop processes in order to make those foods. So I'm going to cover 3 areas, or rather 2 main areas. I'll start with a little bit about wheat and bread, because this is a presentation about bread. So I'll talk about some of the benefits of wheat. And then I've got 3 industry case studies that I'll just say a few words about that are quite different. Each of those have used some of the benefits that we know about in terms of wheat, flour, bread, and fibre to develop commercial products. And then I'll draw that together in some concluding remarks. So let's start with bread, and we're particularly going to focus on fibre in bread. I'm probably talking to the converted here, but it's worth just taking a look at the table on the right-hand side of the slide, in which we've got some data for white bread and wholemeal bread. This is taken from the Federation of Bakers website. And interesting aspects of this really are the fibre content, in which white bread still has 2.9 grams of fibre per 100 grams. Now that's a average value. It's actually probably a value that is towards the higher end of the range that we would see. But wholemeal has approximately 7 grams of fibre per 100 grams. So these are products that do have appreciable amounts of wheat fibre in them. It's also worth highlighting, although not particularly relevant to this presentation, sugar contents tend to be quite low in bread, and the fat contents tend to be quite low. Now, unfortunately, us consumers change the ball game quite a bit when we make bread into sandwiches. I mentioned that even white bread does contain fibre. If you look at back of the packs for various different manufacturers of white bread, you'll probably see white bread in the range 2.1 to 2.7 grams of fibre per 100 grams, which actually is only just below the level that companies can make claims as a source of fibre, which I think is quite an interesting point, because white bread does get a lot of bad publicity. So I think the message that I would put over is white bread probably isn't as bad as it's made out to be, but wholemeal is most definitely an improvement upon that in terms of its dietary performance. So I mentioned that it's very much about wheat fibre. A lot of the fibre, vitamins and minerals are actually concentrated in the bran layers, and particularly the aleurone layer, just below the outer layer of the bran. And that's why the whole grain or the whole wheat has a lot of benefit over the refined white flour, where quite a lot of that bran has been taken out. And there's a lot of research that has been done that indicates that a wide range of fibres, a wide range of bioactive material is very beneficial for the gut microbiome. Now, wheat itself, and particularly whole grain wheat, got some data here for whole grain wheat and a refined wheat flour. For me, what comes over here, firstly, whole grain wheat does have this high level of fibre. Now, this is per 100 grams of dry matter, but also it's the range of fibres that I think is really interesting here. We've got a range of insoluble fibres, soluble fibres, resistant starches, and there's quite an attractive balance between all of those different fibres. So they will have an activity at different parts of the gut. And refined flour, as you would expect, will have a lot of those bran layers taken out. So the levels are much lower with with refined white flour. And that then takes us on to these areas that have been mentioned by Terry already, probiotics and prebiotics. And also learned quite recently of another category, postbiotics, which is about the chemicals that the microorganisms produce. In terms of wheat and bread, we are really talking about prebiotics, the way that we can use our diet to feed the gut microbes. So let's take a look now at the 3 case studies. 2 of these Camden BRI have been very heavily involved with through Innovate projects. I'll start with one that we haven't had an involvement with. You're probably aware that Kellogg's have quite a lot of publicity on their website about their Happy Gut range of cereal products. They're basically products that have high levels of fibre, of which wheat fibre is one of those main fibre materials. But they've also added other fibres such as chicory root, which has a different blend of fibres to what you'd expect to see in wheat. So it's about getting that blend of fibres. And I think that's a really important message for food product developers. It's not just about the absolute level, it's about getting a blend of fibres so that they have a range of activities within the gut. The first of the products that we've been involved with, this is a company that's been around for a number of years, Everfresh Natural Foods. Their point of difference is that they're making bread and cake products from sprouted grains. And we had an Innovate project with Everfresh, of which the aim of the Innovate project was to, I suppose, update, revamp the technology that Everfresh were being used to make it more effective, and then develop new product ranges as part of that. And with sprouting, it's to do with the germination that happens. And as the germ starts to develop and the plant grows, quite a suite of enzymes are released to break down the larger molecules that otherwise couldn't be utilized by the plant. And there are a number of benefits that have been reported through sprouting, such as improved digestibility of macronutrients, increased vitamin levels, and increased mineral bioavailability. Those are quite widely reported. And the types of products look like the little picture I've put on the right. There's a whole range of breads and cake products. In terms of the technology, there were two areas where the project focused primarily on. One was the sprouting technology, which before the project used a series of crates, and that is a very common way that companies will sprout products. This particular unit operation now involves sprouting vessels. There's a considerably improved level of control. The sprouted wheat grains then get minced and made into the products, baked. Then they get taken out from the tins, repacked. And this is where the second point of difference comes with the Everfresh products. Those products get packed into a barrier packaging material and they're retorted. So the retort process is intended to get rid of any microorganisms that could have recontaminated the product and give it a very long shelf life. So these are bread and cake products that have a year to 18 months shelf life through the retorting process. The second example that Camden BRI have worked very closely with a company is Modern Baker, who makes sourdough bread. Now, over the past 5 years or so, we've had a number of Innovate projects looking at different aspects of sourdough manufacture, such as the fermentation, the materials generated from fermentation, how much fibre can you actually get into a loaf of bread and still make it an acceptable loaf of bread. They now outsource their bread manufacture, and one of the most recent products that they produced is almost like this is the pinnacle of where the company has got to now through all the understanding that's come from the various Innovate projects, is the super loaf. And that's a loaf that is designed to have high fibre. It has sourdough in it, so it has the benefits from the fermentation. So it's a product that meets quite a number of needs that Modern Baker are very interested in for healthy bread products. And if you look at the ingredients list, there are a number of ingredients that are very carefully chosen so that they have, or they offer, functional benefits. And in terms of the messages that are on the back of the pack, these are going to be quite small on your screen, but we have messages about the fibre benefits to the immune system. We have messages about clean label. And so it's a product that meets a number of demands that consumers are interested in. Modern Baker are in quite late stage discussions with a number of retailers about this product. So in terms of my key messages then about wheat bread, wheat fibre, I haven't actually mentioned the top bullet point, but wheat is actually a very beneficial and it's a sustainable crop for the UK we have the right amount of solar radiation, the right amount of rainfall, and we have the right soil. So it's a crop that not only has all these dietary benefits, but it also grows very well in the UK. We don't have to rely on tropical crops to come in. The bioactives and the fibres are very much in the bran layers. So wholemeal flour has a significant benefit over the white flour. And those fibres, and particularly the range of those fibres, are very beneficial for the microbiome. And I've just shown you 3 examples, 2 of which Camden BRI are very active in. But there's a lot of interest from food companies now who are addressing the consumer interests in becoming more healthy. And in actual fact, COVID and the issues with COVID and the relationships that have been publicised in the media between COVID and the immune system have actually strengthened that consumer interest. So that's the end of my presentation. If I stop sharing, I will now pass on to Kevin Sensula.
All right, so hopefully you all can see that. As Gary said, my name is Kevin Sensula, and I'm the marketing manager for probiotics at Kerry, part of Kerry's Proactive Health division, where we essentially sell a portfolio of science-backed branded ingredients that have really been demonstrated to have a positive impact on human health. Really humbled to be here with so many quote unquote expert scientists and technologists. Don't know how I got the opportunity as a marketing guy to be amongst you all, but I think it has something to do with the 5 a.m. start time here in the US. So really privileged to be with you all. And what I'll be sharing this morning is really talking through some key considerations for probiotics as the European regulatory market continues to evolve, and specifically probiotics as they relate to their use in food and beverage applications. So before I get into that, I did just want to touch on the evolving European regulatory environment as it relates to probiotics. If you're the least bit familiar with probiotics and kind of their status in Europe and the EU specifically, you know that through most of the world, probiotics can be called exactly that. They can be referred to as probiotics and marketed as probiotics. In the EU and in most EU member nations today, the term probiotic is not even allowed from a marketing perspective. So most manufacturers and food and beverage companies have to refer to probiotics as cultures on pack. So the Kavita brand, which is owned by PepsiCo in the US, can refer to their beverage as a sparkling probiotic drink. But Innocent, who has a smoothie containing the same exact ingredient, Innocent, with Coca-Cola having a huge stake in that company, Innocent must refer to their beverage as Culture Crush. So it might not sound like a lot there, but it really matters what we call that ingredient and how we talk about it with consumers. This data right here is from Kerry's proprietary global survey, which we conducted at the start of 2021. 56% of US consumers associate probiotics with good digestive health, but only 44% of EU consumers associate cultures or probiotics with good digestive health. So I think a lot of that has to do simply with the semantics and what we're referring to the ingredient as. When you zoom in even further on the EU and look exclusively at those markets where probiotics have to be referred to as cultures, only 38% of consumers make that association with digestive health. Whereas in the markets where it's actually able to be called a probiotic, which today are Italy, Spain, or at least at the time of the survey, we're only Italy and Spain, 53% of consumers make that association. So there really is an impact as far as what we're calling that ingredient and the association consumers have with its ability to provide digestive health benefits. Zooming in on Spain specifically, Spain actually just started allowing the term probiotics on pack in October of 2020. So this is relatively new. In our last consumer survey that we conducted back in 2019, consumer awareness within Spain of probiotics was only at 15%. In 2021, once the term probiotic was allowed, assumingly due to some of the PR that was generated as part of that change, 48% are aware of probiotics today. Similarly, 55% of consumers associate probiotics with digestive health benefits today in Spain, compared to 50% back in 2019. And 71% of Spanish consumers would use or consider a product offering digestive health benefits compared to 51% back in 2019. So I think a lot of this really does have to do with the shift from cultures to probiotics and the news that generated. And Italy and Spain actually aren't the only countries in the EU today that allow the term probiotics. The Netherlands just started allowing the term in March 2021 on both food and beverage labels and also on supplement labels. And Denmark just made the change in May, but only for supplements. And the action isn't over yet either. There's been some murmurs, and I don't want to speak out of turn here given the audience on the call, but there are some murmurs of potentially France and the UK exploring the use of probiotics on packs. So a really exciting time to be in the probiotic space. So with that in mind, I thought I'd give a pretty elementary introduction to probiotics and how they work in the body, and kind of an argument for the health benefits that probiotics provide. So I'll start with the gut microbiota, and both of the earlier speakers touched on this, but starting with the basics, the gut microbiota are those trillions of bacteria that live within your gut that are key to your health and well-being. So obviously you associate the microbiota with the digestive function that it serves, but it does much more than digestion. It helps to reinforce the gut barrier, synthesizes vitamins and metabolites, synthesizes and modulates hormones, and protects against pathogens. So those are all functions within the gut. And then outside the gut, it helps to bolster the immune system, produce and modulate hormones, affect circulating blood lipids, and influence brain, liver, kidney, skin, and vaginal tract function. And the science is continuing to evolve. We're learning more and more about the microbiota and the functions they serve, and the potential impact that a probiotic could have on those functions. Now, all that being said, those are the functions that the microbiota serve when they're performing well, as they should be, but it really doesn't take much to throw off the balance of the gut. Poor diet or changes in diet can negatively impact the functioning of the microbiota. Illness, aging, stress, hormonal changes, consuming an antibiotic or other medication, and travel even can throw off the balance of the gut and the proper functioning of the microbiota. Now, that being said, there are plenty of things you can do to take good care of the microbiota, as each of the earlier speakers mentioned. Eating a diverse range of foods is critically important, especially those high in fiber, as Gary mentioned. Exercising regularly, maintaining a healthy weight, getting enough sleep, only taking an antibiotic when needed, and finally, consuming both prebiotics and probiotics can have a positive impact on the microbiota. So what is a probiotic exactly? Well, the best definition we have at this stage came from the World Health Organization way back in 2002. And they defined probiotics as live microorganisms, which when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. So really three characteristics of a probiotic: needs to be consumed as a live microbe in the diet, must provide a proven health benefit to the consumer, and must be delivered to the digestive tract in efficacious quantities. Now, today, when most people think of probiotics in food and beverages specifically, yogurt and other fermented milk or sour milk products come to mind immediately. And the type of probiotic that's contained in those products is a very specific type. It's called a vegetative probiotic. And the characteristics of those vegetative probiotics is that they're very fragile and vulnerable to environmental conditions, including the low gastric pH of the stomach. They're susceptible to the rigors of most manufacturing processes and the shelf life of food and beverage products. And generally, they need to be refrigerated to survive shelf life. But those aren't the only type of probiotics out there. There's vegetative probiotics, but there's also a type called a spore-forming probiotic, which essentially has a protein-rich outer shell that keeps the probiotic viable through manufacturing, through shelf life, and all the way to the consumer's gut. I think most people immediately go to vegetative cells and think probiotics break down. They're not even viable when they reach the gut. So spore-forming probiotics are really the answer to that. The fact that that protective shell does allow the probiotic to remain viable to the gut and then germinate in the gut, thereby delivering health benefits. Now, another important distinction when it comes to probiotics is that health benefits are strain specific. So you can't just say probiotic and automatically assume digestive health benefits or immune health benefits or some other benefit. Each strain really needs to have peer-reviewed published studies to support its specific benefits. And it truly is the strain level, not just the species, but a level down to the strain. An example that I like to use is the exercise of buying a car. So most of the time when someone is in the process of buying a car or a new vehicle, they have a specific factor or attribute that they're searching for. So in this case, let's imagine the consumer is prioritizing fuel efficiency. You can't just say, I want a car and accept whatever car might come your way. It could be a pickup truck that has very poor fuel efficiency. It could be an SUV, or it could be a sedan or an electric vehicle that obviously has great fuel efficiency. But you really don't know the fuel efficiency of the car until you get a few levels down. So if you know it's a Japanese car, that helps. You can probably assume that it has some degree of fuel efficiency, but you don't know if it meets your threshold of better than 30 miles per gallon. If you know it's a Toyota, that helps even further. Those vehicles are well known for having good fuel efficiency. If you know it's a Toyota Camry, that helps even further. But only when you know the specific year, make, and model of a vehicle, you really know for a fact if it meets that threshold that you're looking for as far as fuel efficiency is concerned. Probiotics work the same way. You can't just know that something's a living microbe and assume it's going to provide health benefits. You need to get a few layers down to lactic acid bacteria of the genus Bacillus, species Bacillus coagulans, and finally the specific strain level, such as Bacillus coagulans GBI-306086, to truly know that that is a microbe or is a probiotic that's going to provide something like digestive health benefits. So in conclusion, just a summary slide here to kind of talk through the key considerations for food and beverage probiotics. Again, as the regulatory market continues to evolve in Europe, it's important for you all as food scientists and technologists, and maybe some of you folks on the regulatory side, to understand what makes a difference for food and beverage probiotics. So first and foremost, it's about stability and survivability through the supply chain. So all the way from the manufacturing of the probiotic itself, shipping for food processing, storage, and throughout shelf life, and then actually the transit to the gut. The probiotic really needs to survive all of those stages to be able to germinate in the gut in efficacious quantities. Second, you need to look for research and science supporting the safety and efficacy. And again, this has to be at the specific strain level. So it's not enough to even know that the Bacillus coagulans species has demonstrated some efficacy. You really need to get down to the specific strain. And then finally, it helps to have a brand or a specific probiotic that seeks to educate consumers and connect with them. You really don't want one of these mystery ingredients, mystery probiotics that's just showing up on the ingredient list, and you really don't know whether you can trust it or whether it truly provides those health benefits. So that's just my perspective from a probiotics industry perspective, the things you should be looking for. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Kate Halliwell, who will lead us through some Q&A. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the speakers for some great presentations there. And I think a really interesting balance around the kind of the basics of the science on and the gut microbiota, and then both pre and probiotics, but also through into product, which of course is really important for a lot of the guys who are on and listening in terms of what we need to think about as food manufacturers, and also how to communicate that through to the consumer and what it might mean to them. Can I invite everyone who is listening in to put questions to our panel? We've got about 15 minutes or so. You can do that. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in your question, or if someone else has already asked something that you think is really interesting, you can vote, and that kind of makes it go up my screen, so I'm more likely to see it and to ask it. So while people are having a think about what they want to ask, I'm going to start with what might be a really basic question, actually, and I'll start it with Martin. So you talked about the kind of the diversity in the microbiome. Most people have about 40, I think you said, but it's up to 1,000 species. And if you have a really limited number, then that leads to ill health. So is there a kind of optimal diversity that we should have, and why, you know, is more always going to be better? And what are the kind of things that make that really important in terms of health?
Well, generally, the more diverse, the better. And that can be, you know, you can affect that just by varying your diet quite a bit. The problem with having a restricted microbiota is that it limits in terms of what kind of metabolism it can do, and so it can skew things within your metabolic range, not produce the broader range of chemicals, for instance, that might influence the brain and how you feel and your general well-being. So it's trying to get that balance right, and that balance is best affected by looking at the range of foods that you that you're eating. And, you know, as both Gary and Kevin have talked about, you know, the importance of being able to make sure that food gets down. So having these sort of foods that are a little bit more resistant to digestion within the small intestine, so that they feed into that fermentative powerhouse of the colon, which is where the vast majority of our microbes exist.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come in that I think specifically relate to bread, or certainly to your presentation, Gary. So there's a comment around, is there a balance between getting the kind of benefits, the prebiotic benefits for fibre, but kind of balancing that with the increase in intolerances that we seem to be seeing within the population as we get higher fibre levels? And also a question around that sterilisation part of the procedure that you mentioned, and whether that impacts into the benefits that the products are providing.
If I go with the first one, to do with the digestive intolerance, that's most certainly a very relevant issue. It also is very relevant for sugar reduction strategies, because many companies in reducing sugar are going down the route of using inulin type of products. Inulin, of course, is a fibre, so it does have benefits because it is a fibre, but there are most definitely limits to the amount of inulin that we should be consuming, because it does cause a number of issues, irritable bowel syndrome. So there are definitely limits. I believe there are also regulatory limits on the amount of inulin that can go in certain products like cakes. So yes, there most definitely is going to be a balance. In terms of the sterilisation, now that's an interesting one, because if it's microorganisms that are being introduced, then a sterilisation process has enough heat involved with it that it will inactivate the microorganisms. That's sterilisation. Now, pasteurisation is a lower level of heat process, and Kevin was talking about Bacillus coagulans being a spore former. The spores are quite resistant, so it is very possible that spores can still be active with a product that is pasteurised and therefore stable. In terms of the effects of heat sterilisation or heat pasteurisation on the fibre materials, I have to say I don't know what that effect actually is. I don't know whether Martin would be able to comment on any sort of heat effects on the fibres. I know that when Modern Baker have done work using the model guts up at Newcastle University, that there were some clear benefits for the sourdough fermented bread that they have with high fibre, which suggests that there are some benefits coming through, despite the fact that the bread has a baking and therefore heat sterilisation process. But it's a very good question to do with what does the heat do to those materials.
So heat will affect, depending on the nature of the fibre, it will affect it. In some cases, the effects are fairly minor, others are a bit more significant. Heat, of course, because you're putting in more energy, can encourage breakdown and so on. So in other words, you know, it can reduce the level of fibre, but depending on the nature of the fibre and how it's derived, that fibre can remain intact even under some of the higher temperature processing regimes. So it really just depends on the nature of the fibre.
Okay, interesting. And actually, sort of slightly linked in that somebody's asked around soluble and insoluble fibres, and do they both impact the microbiota? And I actually noticed on, which might be initially for Martin, but I noticed on your presentation, Gary, on the bread, it had the strapline was something like the best thing since veg. Again, so I guess it's that different types of fibre and the impacts that might have. Martin,
yes, that's very, very true. My understanding is that both soluble and insoluble fibres have a very active role to play within the digestion system. What Modern Baker were trying to do with their bread was to get that blend of fibres into the bread that was similar, not the same, but similar to what you'd expect to get with fruit and veg. So it's about the blend of fibres.
So yes, you're quite correct. I mean, both soluble and insoluble fibres are digested by bacteria. The insoluble ones are slightly more tricky for them to access, but they are able to do both. And of course, you know, part of the trick of trying to improve quality of food is to have high levels of fiber, and that high level of fiber just means that you change the processing technique so that you might, for instance, retain more cellular structure, as an example, so that the content remains higher. So more of it goes into the colon, so therefore you get less calorific value, especially from the carbohydrate component from the small intestine, and less even in terms of the degradation that takes place in the large intestine. So in terms of addressing our national problem of having too much food, and the fact that most people don't want to eat less, actually just producing food that's higher in fiber has that enormous benefit. It reduces the calorific value, the net calorific value, and that's important.
Yeah, interesting. And again, I kind of linked into that. I think there's quite a popular question about effectively the impacts, and in fact, Martin, you talked about vegetarian and vegan foods, and I'd sort of noted down, oh, I wonder, does that mean we need to start thinking about microbiota with alternative proteins, for example, which was an area mentioned in the recently published Dimbleby report. Someone else has highlighted from the Dimbleby report about, well, I guess thinking about kind of processed foods. So maybe processed burgers, let's say, as an example, that are, you know, haven't typically been in our diet, that are being looked at to be meat replacers. And what do we have a sense of what the impact of that might be if people are swapping from a burger to a vegetarian burger, let's say, compared to maybe what might be more typically thought of as a vegetarian vegan diet with a whole range of whole grain type of foods?
Really interesting question, and again, it all comes down to the type of processing that's been applied to the food. So there are different types of processing. So people think processing and processed food, it's bad. That's completely wrong, of course. It's the type of processing and the nature of the effect that the process has on the food and the food structure and the integrity of that food structure. So food processing, you know, can be really very helpful, you know, if you process it in such a way that you maintain a lot of cell structure in it. That means that you know, you will get less calories out of it, and depending on where you're applying that food, you know, that can be very much a good thing, as I've mentioned. In terms of, you know, the different types of foods that we put into our intestine, to be honest, our microbiota aren't too fussy about whether it's really vegan or vegetarian or meat derived. They will, so long as they have access to some of the food sources in there, they will thrive. And so it's that combinations of foods that are present that is going to be important. And there's a whole range of other things that, you know, people are getting very clever about, you know, adding extra bits to food. I mean, you know, part of the vegetarian issue is, you know, are we going to lose the iron because we're not having all of that heme? But, you know, we're now adding in these sort of heme-like molecules to provide that extra flavor and provide that iron. So all of these things are really clever stuff, and they all have an effect. And it is important for a microbiome because they've got to be able to get hold of those micronutrients, things like iron from the heme and so on, which are very important too.
Yeah, no, there certainly is a whole range of clever foods, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more coming through. Kevin, if I can bring you in, and there's a question, again, kind of thinking about Western populations and health more generally, and where is it that you think that probiotics would be having the most impact in terms of improving health?
Yes, so I saw that question in the chat, and I think it asked specifically about a recent finding from a study that I was unfamiliar with. So I appreciate you framing the question in a more marketeer-friendly way, I'd say. But I'd say the impact on health that probiotics can provide is entirely dependent on the individual consumer. Going back to my point on strain specificity, there are certain strains of probiotics that should solely be used for supplementation for healthy individuals to ensure that the microbiome and the gut microbiota continue to function exactly as they should. And there are other probiotic strains that have been shown to have really positive effects on patients experiencing abdominal discomfort or IBS. So the example I'd use would be that our core probiotic ingredient in Carry is called BC30. It's that Bacillus coagulans strain, and that's a probiotic that's solely been shown to help support digestive health. So pretty at a pretty basic level, helping the functioning of the microbiome. Carry recently acquired a Canadian company by the name of BioK that has a Lactobacillus acidophilus strain, and Lactobacillus acidophilus is the most prevalent strain in the world today. It very commonly appears in yogurt. So when it's in yogurt, it's again performing this very basic digestive support function. But the specific strain that BioK has actually helps patients with IBS, and it actually started in a hospital setting to support patients who are on a number of medications and help ensure that they either didn't develop IBS, or that if they had IBS, they were able to get out of it. So the degree to which probiotics can help health, I would say, is entirely dependent on the individual consumer or patient, and the very specific species and strain that we're considering there.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And because thinking about, or a couple of things that struck me in your presentation, actually. So one was around, seemed to be an enormous uplift in Spain in terms of awareness once labelling was there, which given I spend quite a bit, or I have historically spent quite a bit of my life being very frustrated that no one seems to read labels, I thought was actually, I don't know, the Spanish are very different to the UK market, but that seemed quite astonishing to me, actually. But I guess that, you know, so there's that awareness, and presumably some of that is just an awareness that's in the product, and they already have an idea about what a probiotic meant. You know, as a corporate question, do you track that through to see if that drives sales, or have you just looked to see if it drives awareness? And if it has driven sales, do you think you'll get some sort of backlash around this is kind of companies pushing it, even though actually as a health claim it wasn't approved through EFSA?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I'd say it absolutely drives consumer interest in probiotics and sales. Italy started allowing the term probiotic in 2012, and Italy is by far our most active European market for our probiotic ingredients. It's too early to tell in Spain, but I would expect a similar impact there. And I mean, you're exactly right that when the term probiotics is allowed, if consumers become interested, then food manufacturers become interested, and that inevitably leads to more probiotics included in food products, which leads to more sales. To answer the second part of your question, that's a bit more challenging one, because it is true that even within the scientific community, whether you're talking about food technologists or researchers or others, they're very split on the impact of probiotics. And that obviously presents some challenges from a regulatory perspective when the medical community and regulatory are very closely linked. But I'd say ultimately, again, it depends on the individual strain that you're talking about. I think people like to paint it black and white. Either probiotics are good or probiotics don't do anything. And I think that's oversimplifying probiotics overall. And I think you really need to dive into an individual strain to make a decision about whether a probiotic is effective, and to really allow consumers to be able to access research very easily and understand for themselves, does this probiotic do anything? And if it does, to what extent can it actually help my health? So that would kind of be my position, both individually and from a Carry perspective.
Yeah, no, and I can certainly see, of course, strains incredibly important. And I guess, well, as is always the problem when you have to have quite simple messages on a label, really, and the reality of how much people will dive into the science, it can make it quite difficult, I think, when you have to have generic messages to give actually quite a specific information. We probably have time just for one more, we might have time for two if we're lucky, but I think because it's potentially a quick one, there is a question about the super loaf. So back to you, Gary, and the fact that it had apple cider vinegar. Somebody had some real eagle eyes when they were looking at your presentation, and effectively that does seem to have become something that's a bit of a popular ingredient at the moment. And I'm wondering, is that a Does that do anything in terms of the microbiome? Is it just part of the kind of baking process, so it's there for more of a functional role within the bread?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. It's primarily there as a functional role, because with bread there are several issues with shelf life, but from the microbiological side of shelf life, mold is often thought as the main issue with bread. Now, cider vinegar will have a small effect on mold, so it'll help to increase the shelf life before mold starts to grow. What it also does, it has a very important role in lowering the pH of bread. And the second issue with shelf life is bacteria, different bacilli, Bacillus subtilis, Licheniformis, that are spore formers that won't get inactivated in the baking process because they're too heat resistant. They can germinate over the shelf life. And when they germinate and start growing, they produce amylases. Those amylases break down the starches into sugar substances. You get ropey strands of sugar in bread. By adding materials such as cider vinegar, the pH drops and those spores don't want to germinate. And so they lie dormant within the bread. So it's primarily functional, but there also are some of the health benefits that you can sort of read up about that. I guess it all helps to have those as well.
Excellent. That's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we could, well, I certainly could chat about this for ages. I find it so interesting. But we have actually come to the end of the time for the session. So I'm going to hand back over to Terry to close us out.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Martin, Gary and Kevin, for your presentations. They've been fascinating. And of course to Kate for moderating the questions. And thank you to all the people who've been participating. We've got 54 on at the moment, so that's fantastic. Probably from across the globe. But thank you all for attending the webinar and asking such interesting questions. I think we did manage to answer them all, so you don't necessarily need to have any burning questions answered straight away. But if you do have questions, then the email addresses for our speakers are on the screen now, so you can ask them that way. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar, including the Q&A session, to everyone who attended today via email and on our online webinar hub at ifst.org/webinars. So before you log off, please do fill in our short survey, which will launch after the webinar ends. And thank you so much again, Martin, Gary, Kevin and Kate and everyone for attending today. Goodbye.